My sincere greetings to each and every one of you listening as I continue to give what I believe to be one of the most important talks I've ever given. Beware of the World Health Organization, otherwise known as the WHO. Why? Now let us turn our attention to the World Health Organization. Why? Because the WHO has tremendous influence and power over our very lives. What has happened in 2009 as regards the WHO, I will explain mostly from the perspective of two main whistleblowers, namely Jane Burgermeister, a medical journalist from Austria, and Dr. Teresa Forcadis, a non-physician from Spain. Teresa Forcadis made a video in Spanish with English subtitles in order to warn the world via the internet against the swine flu vaccine. I strongly encourage you to watch her video. You'll be greatly enlightened about the pandemic. And please tell your family and friends about the video. I wish to highlight parts of Teresa Forcadis' talk. The following information about her video can be found at www.globalresearch.ca. Teresa states that according to health specialists, swine flu has a lower mortality rate than the annual flu. And I quote, "Recognized health specialists, among whom are Dr. Bernard Debray and Dr. Juan Jose Rodriguez Sendin, have publicly declared that the information obtained from the flu season in the Southern Hemisphere showed that the swine flu has a lower mortality rate and complication rate than the annual flu. Yet, the WHO declared a pandemic on April 29, 2009, 12 days after the detection of the first cases of the swine flu. How could they do this? The answer is in the fact that in early May 2009, the WHO had changed its definition of what a pandemic is. I repeat, the WHO changed its definition of what a pandemic is. Dr. Thomas Jefferson, who's been studying for 15 years the nature of influenza and vaccines with the Cochrane Collaboration, a nonprofit independent organization that reviews a wide variety of healthcare research, he explained the change in the motive behind WHO's definition of a pandemic. He states, the earlier WHO definition reads, an influenza pandemic occurs when a new influenza virus appears against which the human population has no immunity, resulting in epidemics worldwide with enormous numbers of deaths and illnesses. The revised definition removes this phrase, quote, with enormous numbers of deaths and illnesses, which significantly lowers the bar for defining a pandemic. When asked about this change, Dr. Jefferson said, I'm wondering if this means that the world will always be in a pandemic. The world will always be doubly vaccinated, and the world will always be spending a huge amount of money for vaccines, and of course, buying antiviral drugs by the barrel load. Later in the interview, Dr. Jefferson takes off his gloves and states simply that the so-called pandemic is a commercial operation. As I said earlier, you see, we all know that the love of money and power corrupts. It is most interesting to note that the change in the definition of a pandemic occurred shortly after the United States declared a state of national health emergency, despite having only 20 people affected with the swine flu virus and no deaths whatsoever. With the old definition of a pandemic, the WHO could never have declared a pandemic with only 20 people affected and no deaths. As I mentioned earlier, the WHO wields tremendous power over our very lives and can require mandatory vaccinations. As Jane Burgermeister said, quote, immediately following the announcement by the WHO in July, order of mass vaccinations, all 194 countries that have signed the international health regulations, including the US, are obliged to give mass vaccinations and prepare for other measures such as quarantines as and when mandated by the WHO. As it is right now today as I speak, the Ukraine is under martial law and receiving forced vaccinations. Many are dying, but it's very curious. You don't hear about it in the media. Jane Burgermeister warns against the WHO. Jane Burgermeister has recently filed criminal charges with the FBI against the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and several others of the highest ranking government and corporate officials concerning bioterrorism and attempts to commit mass murder. She's also prepared an injunction against forced vaccination, which is being filed in America. These actions follow her charges filed in April against Bacter AG and Green Hills Biotechnology of Austria for producing contaminated bird flu vaccine, alleging that this was a deliberate act to cause and profit from a pandemic. Jane Burgermeister goes on to explain just what lies behind the decision of the WHO to declare a pandemic. She states, there is evidence from a WHO memo dated from 1972 that WHO describes a method for using injections, vaccines, to kill people in 3 steps. First, by weakening the immune system. Second, by injecting a huge dose of virus into the body, which the weakened immune system cannot fight. And third, by injecting an adjuvant that triggers a massive inflammatory reaction and a cytokine storm. She goes on to say, there is evidence that the swine flu vaccines mandated by WHO follow the same 3-step process outlined in the aforementioned WHO memos, and so intentionally cause damage and death. It appears WHO is systematically conceding evidence of the deadlines of these vaccines, classified as bioweapons by the US and the European Union regulators, in an act of fraudulent misrepresentation to get the populations of these countries to take the vaccine of their own free will.